We've been going through all the kings of Israel and Judah, and we're actually to the very last king. The very last king before they go into captivity here. And in verse number 10 it says, "And when the year was expired, King Nebuchadnezzar sent and brought him to Babylon with the goodly vessels of the house of the Lord, and made Zedekiah his brother king over Judah and Jerusalem. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. And he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord his God, and humbled not himself before Jeremiah the prophet, speaking from the mouth of the Lord. He also rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar, who had made him swear by God, but he stiffened his neck and hardened his heart from turning unto the Lord God of Israel. Moreover, all the chief of the priests and the people transgressed very much after all the abominations of the heathen, and polluted the house of the Lord, which he had hallowed in Jerusalem. And the Lord God of their fathers sent to them by his messengers, rising up betimes, and sending, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they mocked the messengers of God, and despised his words, and misused his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord arose against his people, till there was no remedy." I'll stop reading right there. But again, so this is Zedekiah. He's going to be the last king of Judah. He was the third son of Josiah, who became king of Judah. And actually, his nephew was king before him. Jeconiah was king before him, and Nebuchadnezzar took him out after 3 months of reigning. And when he took him out, he put Zedekiah, his uncle, in his place. And so here we have Zedekiah. And again, I want us to always remember that we are talking about a son of Josiah, and I don't want us to forget that. Sometimes you just get to rolling in with who the guy is, but you have to remember who his father was and the relationship his father had with God, and the purity of Josiah's religion, the fact that he turned to God when he didn't even have the word of God, when there were no real messengers, of God who came to him. He turned to God, and we know who Josiah's father was. We know who Josiah's grandfather was, and yet Josiah turned to God when everything was against him. But here you have Josiah's three sons. Then we've already studied the other two, but now we're here at the last one, Zedekiah. And it appears to me, of the three, that Zedekiah did at least have an inkling. He had just the slightest thing, because he kept going back to Jeremiah. He kept going back to him, said, "Hey, have you heard a word from the Lord? Have you heard a word from the Lord?" And we're gonna see that this week. But hey, have you heard a word from the Lord? And even though he continued to ask, there was Matthew Henry. I was reading him, and Matthew Henry said he had conviction and he had corruption. And I thought about that. I said, that's pretty good, Brother Parks. There are a lot of people. That even this day, they grew up in church. They grew up around church, and they have some sort of. And again, if you want to argue over the terminology, conviction, it's not really conviction if they're so willing to let it go. But they have this conviction. They have this feeling. They have this thing that they know that it's not right, but their corruption overcomes their convictions. And they just can't help themselves. And so I thought about that whenever he said, conviction and corruption. I thought, how many people do we know even in this day and age that they know they shouldn't, but their corruption overcomes whatever conviction they have, and they go and do what they know they shouldn't do anyway. And so last week when we were talking about Zedekiah, I read in Jeremiah chapter number 28 where Hananiah prophesied and said, hey, in 2 years everything's going to be good. In 2 years everything's going to be good. And Jeremiah's like, amen, all right, good for you. But the word of the Lord came to him and said, hey, you need to go tell him what he said wasn't right, and within a short space of time you're going to be dead. And he died. And so then we got to chapter number 37, and we looked in chapter number 37, and that was one of the first times that Jeremiah had talked to Zedekiah, and so in verse number 13 was where I showed y'all. In verse 13 it said, when he was in the gate of Benjamin, he was so Jeremiah. Let me read verse 12. Then Jeremiah went forth out of Jerusalem to go into the land of Benjamin, to separate himself thence in the midst of the people. And when he was in the gate of Benjamin, a captain of the ward was there, whose name was Arijah, the son of Shelmiah, the son of Hananiah. So he was the grandson of Hananiah, and he still had this bitterness towards Jeremiah because of his grandfather passing away, and Jeremiah calling him a false prophet. And so they took Jeremiah and said, you're going to the Chaldeans. And Jeremiah was like, hey, that's not what I'm doing. I'm just leaving. That's false. But they put him in prison anyway. They put him in prison anyway. And that's the first time, and I think I said it right as I was closing last week, that Zedekiah was a weak man. Zedekiah was a weak man. It's funny. I'm sure even in this class right here, if we sat down and did the personality test, I know Miss Diane and your daughter like those personality tests. My wife liked doing the personality test, and you go through and you answer all these silly questions, and you answer these questions, and it's going to tell you what your personality is. And then you read into it, and then sometimes you're like, oh, you know what, that is kind of me. That is me right there. And so it actually gets pretty close. You're like, yeah, that's me. All right, that's right, yeah. And so it gets pretty close. I don't think it's perfect, but I mean, again, even in this class, we went through and we did all the personalities. We're not all going to have the same personality. Some of us are going to be, more choleric. We're going to be much more forceful, and some of us are going to be much more laid back and just kind of, hey, we're just going to kind of live with it how it goes. And I tell people all the time. People ask me, they're like, hey, what do you like? I'm like, I just want to be my own boss. That's what I like to be. I don't have the need to boss anyone else around, but I don't want to be bossed around. I just want to kind of do my own thing, and that's how I work best. And if I need to be the boss, I can be the boss. And if I need to be under someone, I can be under someone. But if I'm happy, I'm just, you just tell me what needs to be done and just leave me alone and let me do my thing. And so, but different people have different personalities. But Zedekiah had a weak personality. He had a weak personality, and we're going to see that. We're going to see that a couple times here. We're going to see this first in the fact that he allowed Jeremiah, and again, Jeremiah is prophesying something, and he's just telling them what God's saying. And he's telling them what God's saying. And I don't want us to forget, and I know I kind of focus on Jeremiah here, but Ezekiel was prophesying at the same time as well. Ezekiel was prophesying the exact same time as well, but it appears that Jeremiah had a personal audience with Zedekiah where Ezekiel was doing more prophesying to the people, where Jeremiah was not only prophesying to the people, but he was also had a personal audience with Zedekiah multiple times. And so they put Jeremiah in the prison. They put him in the prison, and they put him down there in the prison, and then Zedekiah calls him out in verse number 17. Then Zedekiah the king sent and took him out, and the king asked him secretly in his house. Again, you're the king. Think about this. You're the king. You're in charge. Everyone, when you're top man, you're top man, and everyone else is underneath you. And again, so everyone else is underneath him. But he goes to Jeremiah and he brings him in and he talks to him secretly. And we're going to see that again where here in the next chapter where he's going to say like, hey, don't tell them. If they come and ask you what we talked about, don't you tell them what you told me. Why? Because he was weak. Because he was weak. He's going to come up with an excuse as to why he can't go to the Chaldeans, because he was scared people were going to make fun of him. And so it's very sad that this is who became the leader. And again, I mean, it was God's timing, but he became the leader. But even people who are weak could be dependent upon God and say, hey, God, can you help me? I'm not strong. I'm not strong. I'm not a choleric. I am not this forceful personality. You know, I mean, some people are just naturally forceful. I mean, Brother Sammy was just a natural leader. He was a natural born leader, and he would just tell people what needed to be done and just expect it to get done. Some people are natural born leaders, but some people are not. They're just followers. And sometimes when you get a follower who's in the place of leadership, they don't know what to do. They don't know how to lead. They're scared to lead. And so that's who Zedekiah was. And so he calls on Jeremiah, and he's like, hey, we need to do this in secret. And he says, is there any word from the Lord? In verse number 17 of Jeremiah 37, sorry, I may not have told you that. Is there any word from the Lord? And Jeremiah said, there is. Thou shalt be delivered into the hand of the king of Babylon. Now, again, I mean, you think about what's going on, and Jeremiah, he's been put in prison. He's been put in prison. And I want you to notice something. I noticed it in my reading. I guess sometimes you just gloss over it and you don't think about it. And anyone in here can probably quote Jeremiah 33:3. Anyone in here can quote Jeremiah 33:3. But in Jeremiah 31, verse number 1, moreover, the word of the Lord came unto Jeremiah the second time, while he was yet shut up in the court of the prison. And so Jeremiah 33:3 that we quote so many times when we're wanting something from God and expecting God to do something, have you ever thought about the fact that God sent that to Jeremiah while he was shut up in the prison? It wasn't like, hey, Jeremiah's up on the mountaintop and everything's going great, and God says, hey, Jeremiah, guess what? You call unto me and I'll answer thee and show thee great mighty things, thou knowest not. He gave that verse to Jeremiah while he was in prison. While he was shut up in prison, God gave that verse to Jeremiah. And so just something, not necessarily part of the lesson this morning, but just something that as I was reading, I saw that, and I'm like, how many times do we just look at Jeremiah 33 and only focus in on 33:3 and not understand the context of where Jeremiah was when God gave him that verse? But Jeremiah was true. He was a true man of God. And said, hey, look, this is the word. The word's not going to change. I mean, people like, hey, if I do this to him, then he'll change. And guess what? God didn't change his word, and God wasn't going to change his word. And so he said, look, you're going to be delivered. You are going to be delivered. This is going to happen. And so again, I mentioned it multiple times last week. We're going to look at it again this week, that God is going to give Zedekiah an out. We talked about that a bunch last week. God gives people an out. God gives them an opportunity to get out of the punishment, whether it's, going to hell. You don't have to go to hell. People go to hell because they chose to go to hell, not because they chose to reject what God did for them. And so here God gave them an out. And people, even sin, God gives, when you're in temptation, God makes a way of escape for you. And you have to choose. Again, back to conviction or corruption, even in that, you have to choose whether you're going to follow along in your convictions and take the out that God gives you, or you're going to allow your corruption to overtake you in your convictions and follow along and go into sin. But God gives him an out, and we read it in 2 Chronicles how that Zedekiah basically stiffened his neck. He stiffened his neck, and I thought about Proverbs 29, where he that being often reproved and hardeneth his neck shall suddenly be destroyed, and that without remedy. And I read that even in Chronicles right there. The very last thing I read when I read to you in Chronicles was it was without remedy. Without remedy. Why? Because God had sent his messengers, and he said messengers, not just Jeremiah, but Ezekiel, and probably some other men that we don't know about. But he sent those messengers to those people and said, hey, this is going to happen. You need to do this. And eventually, the word was not, hey, get right with God and God's going to change your circumstance. The word was, hey, you need to go to the Chaldeans while you have a chance. You need to go to the Chaldeans. Why? Because God said, hey, I'm going to let that land rest. I'm going to let that land rest. The land is going to observe its Sabbaths. If you're not going to observe them, then I'm going to take you out of the land so the land does observe the Sabbaths. And so the message was, hey, you need to go to the Chaldeans. And again, that's a tough thing. You think in the mind of a military man, what military man wants to surrender? What military man wants to become a prisoner of war? What military man, could say like, hey, look, we're not going to win this thing. Again, if you're a fighter, they were talking, Bub was telling me a story about a guy this week, and the guy said, look, he said, here's my philosophy in fighting. I just keep swinging until they stop. And he said, I know I'm going to get hit. I'm going to get hit a lot, but I just keep swinging until they get tired of swinging, one way or another, whether they're laid out on the ground or whether they just are so wore out and realize they're not going to beat me. And that's what military men's mindset is. Hey, we're just going to keep fighting. We're going to keep fighting. We're never going to surrender. But God told the people of Judah and Jerusalem, hey, that you only have one chance, and that's surrender. That's your only chance. And again, in the context of salvation, when it comes to salvation, if you're going to get saved, you have to surrender. You have to surrender. You have to say, all right, that's it. I'm done. I'm not fighting this anymore. I'm giving up. I can't fix this on my own. And I'm completely trusting what Jesus did for me. I'm full surrender. And so he told him, he said, look, he said, this is going to happen. This is going to happen. And so in verse number 18, Jeremiah is again talking to Zedekiah. He said, moreover, Jeremiah said unto Zedekiah, what have I offended? He said, look, why didn't y'all put me in prison? You knew I was not going to the Chaldeans, but I told you should go. But I was not a part of the Chaldean. I was not a counter spy for the Chaldeans, and I was trying to trick the people of Judah and Jerusalem. I'm telling you from the word of God that God said go to the Chaldeans, and Zedekiah, in your heart that the word I told you is a true word, and you're rejecting that word. And so you knew I wasn't going to them, and yet you allowed them to put me in prison anyway. And he said, what have I offended against thee, or against thy servants, or against this people, that ye have put me in prison? Where are now your prophets? He said, hey, where is Hananiah? Show me, where is Hananiah? Oh, I know, he's dead. And where is his prophecy where he said within 2 years, the people are coming back and all the treasures from the house of the Lord are coming back. He said, where are your prophets? Where are your prophets now, which prophesied unto you, saying, the king of Babylon shall not come against you, nor against this land? He said, look, you know what I'm telling you is right. Therefore, hear now, I pray thee, O my Lord the king. And again, now you understand, he's very humble right here. Again, because he's petitioning the king. Now, when he's saying, hey, this is what God said, he's bold as a lion. But now he's being very humble. Why? Because, the king has the power to throw him back into prison. And he says, O my Lord the king, let my supplication, I pray thee, be accepted before thee, that thou cause me not to return to the house of Jonathan the scribe, lest I die there. He said, look, don't you put me back down there. Probably they weren't feeding him there. And he said, look, if you put me back down there, I'm going to die down there. And so Zedekiah says, hey, look, you know what? You're right. I shouldn't have done that. I shouldn't have done that. And so He doesn't say, hey, you get your full release. He doesn't give him that freedom. But he says, hey, we're going to put you in the court of the prison here in the house. We're going to feed you. We're going to take care of you. As long as there's bread here in Jerusalem, you're going to have bread. We're going to take care of you, and it's going to be okay. But Jeremiah in chapter number 38, Jeremiah still had influence. He still had influence. People were still coming and talking to him. So look in verse number 1 of chapter number 38. Then Shephatiah the son of Mattan, and Gedaliah the son of Pashur, and Jukal the son of Shelemiah, and Pashur the son of Malchiah heard the words that Jeremiah had spoken unto all the people. So again, he's still speaking, and they hear these words, and they're like, we thought if we put him in prison, if we just put him in prison, he'd just be quiet. We thought if we just put him in prison for a little while, and you saw that in 2022. You saw that in 2022. If y'all remember the pastor from Canada who was speaking out against the lockdowns, he was speaking out against the lockdowns, and they were because he was like, hey, you can't shut my church down, and they came in and put him in prison. They're like, you're going to be quiet. They let him out, and he wasn't quiet. And they're like, we'll put you right back in. They were trying to get him to be quiet against the lockdowns, and so that's still something that could happen in this day. But these people, they come, and look what happens. Here's what Jeremiah said. Thus saith the Lord, he that remaineth in this city shall die by the sword, by the famine, by the pestilence, but he that goeth forth to the Chaldeans shall live. Again, this is something difficult. You think, think about it just in our day. Miss Jimmy, think about the house that you live in, and someone comes and says, hey, you know what? If you're going to live, you're going to have to leave. If you're going to live, you're going to have to leave. Again, a lot of us in here have our houses, and we have our land, and we have our property, and we have all our stuff. And basically, the prophet is saying, hey, you're going to have to go make yourselves prisoners of war. You're going to have to go to the Chaldeans and say, yes, whatever you want to do with us, do with us. We don't have anything left back there. Whatever you say, that's what we're going to do. That's what they were told. And again, I can understand that it was a very difficult thing to hear, but you have to understand they brought that on themselves. They brought that on themselves. Again, because God said there came a point where there was no remedy. There was no remedy. There was no fixing it. There was no, okay, they had their opportunity to get right in Josiah's day. We're only, 22, so we're only like 22, 23 years from, probably less than that because we're not all the way through yet. So we're probably only 20-some years from Josiah's day. And if you remember Josiah, he cleaned up Judah, he cleaned up Jerusalem, he cleaned up Israel. He went into Israel and took away the things that they were worshiping falsely in Israel. They had their opportunity. They had their chance. Even though it was pronounced in Hezekiah's day that one day the Chaldeans would come up and do this, but yet they had their opportunity. And so in verse number 3, he explains that the king of Babylon, he's going to take Jerusalem. It's going to happen. He's going to take it. There's no if, there's no ands, there's no buts, there's no possibility. Your army's not strong enough. And you think that once they surround that city, that army got weaker and weaker and weaker till eventually they just walk in. They just walk in. There was no fight. There was no fight. And so in verse number 4, therefore the princes said unto the king, we beseech thee, let this man be put to death. They didn't just ask to put him in another prison. They didn't just say, hey, we need to keep him quiet. They said the only way to keep him quiet is put him to death. Let this man be put to death, for thus he weakeneth the hands of the men of war that remain in this city, and the hands of all the people, in speaking such words unto them, for this man seeketh not the welfare of this people, but the hurt. And you know who knew better? Zedekiah knew better. He knew that was not true. He knew that was not true. He knew that that was a lie. He knew those princes were lying. He knew, because we're going to see him ask again. He knew that what Jeremiah was saying was coming from God, and yet look at what he does. Again, because he's weak. Then Zedekiah the king said, behold, he's in your hand. For the king is not he that can do anything against you. He said, look, they said, we want to kill him. And he said, all right, he's in your hand. Y'all do whatever you want to. And the king, there's not a thing I can do about it. Again, that's our 2022 English. But that's what he says. He said, for the king is not he that can do anything against you. How is it that you can be king and not say, hey, guess what? No, you're not going to do it. No, I said he's going to be here in this prison, and I said we're going to feed him, and if you don't like it, too bad for you. But that's not what he does. Again, he's a weak man. He is a weak man. He is a weak leader. And because of that, he gets tossed to and fro, back and forth. The thing that he knows is right, but he just can't submit to. And the thing that he knows is wrong, but he just keeps surrendering to. It's the conviction and the corruption that he just goes back and forth on. And here he basically pronounces a death sentence on Jeremiah. We know it doesn't happen, but he pronounces a death sentence on Jeremiah. Why? Because, well, he's just weak. In verse number 6, then took they Jeremiah and cast him into the dungeon of Malchiah, the son of Hamelech, that was in the court of the prison, and they let down Jeremiah with cords, and in the dungeon there was no water but mire, so Jeremiah sunk in the mire. So get the picture right there. So it appears to me, Brother Carl, it's just this huge hole. It's just this huge hole that goes way down in the building, and down in the bottom where everything is flowing down into, all the trash and nastiness. Again, there's no water down there but mire. They drop him down in there, Gil, and it's almost like, I picture like a swamp, but almost like a swamp where it looks like you're standing on something solid, but the longer you stand, the deeper and deeper and deeper you sink in it. And they let him down with cords. They let him down through there. There was no ladder. There was no anything. They let him down there, and they were going to let him die down there. And in their minds, no doubt, they're like, well, we actually didn't kill him. He died on his own because we just let him down there. He died on his own. It wasn't like we actually took a knife and killed him or shot him with an arrow or something like that. We just let him down. And sometimes even evil men have some form of a conscience, and they override their conscience by trying to come up with a way to say, well, here's my out. I can say, well, I really didn't kill the prophet Jeremiah. We just let him down right there, and his body was so weak and so frail. We came back to feed him, and we came back to give him water, and he'd already passed away. So they let him down. Again, Zedekiah gave them permission to kill him by saying, he's in your hands. But none of the men wanted to be the one to say, hey, I killed Jeremiah, so they come up with a way to kill him without killing him. And I think one spot it even said, and I don't have it written down, but one spot, was basically like saying, hey, Jeremiah, you chose your own death. So they set him down in that dungeon, but look at what happened. I mean, again, here is God. Here is God that is using, Jeremiah can't plead for himself. He's down in this dungeon. He's down in that dungeon. He can't plead for himself. And God has someone in that has influence with the king again. And so in verse number 7, now when Ebed-Melech, the Ethiopian, one of the eunuchs, which was in the king's house, heard that they had put Jeremiah in the dungeon, The king then sitting in the gate of Benjamin, Ebed-melech, went forth out of the king's house and spake to the king, saying, My lord, the king, these men have done evil in all that they have done to Jeremiah the prophet, whom they have cast into the dungeon, and he is like to die for hunger in the place where he is, for there is no more bread in the city. He said, look, king, you know, and again, the king is sitting in a place of judgment right there when he's sitting in the gate of Benjamin. He's sitting in a place of judgment, and so he comes to him and says, hey, look, you know this is not right. You know what you did is not right. You know, but he doesn't say what you did. Again, sometimes we have to be, what's the saying? Wise as serpents and harmless as doves. Sometimes you have to be wise as serpents. I mean, you just can't come out and say, hey, king, you did this and you're guilty. He doesn't say that. He said that what they did. What they did, and gives him an out. That's one of the things when I first moved down here, Brother Parks. I didn't know how to give people an out, and so if my boss did something wrong, we would get into it, and we would get into it. And this guy's like, look, you're right, and you're right, and he knows you're right, but because he's the boss. Because he's the boss, and he's over you, you can't make him look bad. You have to give him an out. You have to give him the opportunity to say, hey, look, you know what? Let me make this decision right here, even though it's the decision that you told him 2 weeks ago he should have made, and it was the wrong decision. He made the wrong decision. Give him an out and let him take the out, and then he feels a little bit better about it. You know you were right all along, but give a man an opportunity, give a man an out. And so this Ethiopian eunuch understand, hey, look, if I just go to him and say, hey, you're going to be the reason Jeremiah dies, he's going to get mad at me and going to put me in prison. But if I come to him and say, hey, look, what these men did is wrong. Jeremiah didn't do anything wrong. He was just, saying what God said. And so the king, he said, look, this shouldn't happen. In verse number 10, then the king commanded Ebed-melech, the Ethiopian, saying, take from hence 30 men. So now he's actually acting like a leader. Again, he could have said, when they said, hey, we want to kill him, he could have said, look, and he could have called 30 men then and said, hey, you princes right here from verse number 1, you guys are out, and you're not going to do this. But it took this place, so he says, you take 30 men with thee and take up Jeremiah the prophet out of the dungeon before he die. He said, you're right. I don't want him to die down there in that dungeon. I don't want it to be on my conscience that I allowed him to die down there in that dungeon. So pull him out. But also understand that every day that goes by, the situation is progressively getting worse. You got to think, if the city has been encircled, and the Chaldeans are around the city, and we looked at that last week where the Chaldeans had been around the city, and then the Egyptians come up and the Chaldeans backed off. And when they backed off, Jeremiah went and told them and said, hey, look, I don't care if the army that you depend on, if they go out and they defeat every one of the Chaldeans, they're going to get up and come, and they're going to burn this city anyway. And so, why? Because the judgment was already pronounced, and he told Zedekiah, he said, hey, you're wasting your time to trust in the Egyptians, because it's God that's fighting against you. So, those Egyptians, they're not going to stay. They're going to go away, because they're not going to protect you, because you're fighting against God. And so again, every day that the Chaldeans were back around the walls, and I know it's going to say in chapter 39, verse number 1, that they're around the walls right there. But again, if they're around the walls, they're saying there's no bread in the city. Y'all remember that I told you that in Jeremiah it's all kind of jumbled up. Sometimes what happens here may happen in chapter 20, and then something that happened actually earlier comes later in the chapter. And so understand that. But every day they're around the wall, people can't get out, people can't get in, you can't farm, you can't do this. And so all they had was what was stored in the city. All he had was a little sword. And even right here, the Ethiopian said, hey, look, he said, there's no bread. There's no bread if you leave him down there, which is, again, an interesting thing that he said it that way, because if you think about it, if there's no bread, it doesn't matter whether you're in the dungeon or whether you're out of the dungeon, there's no bread. But he said it, and the king's like, hey, you know what, you're right, that's a bad idea. And so anyway, so he goes and he says, hey, take 30 men with you. Why? Because he knew that there could be opposition. When no doubt Jeremiah was being guarded. No doubt he was being guarded. And so if just this Ethiopian eunuch shows up and says, hey, I'm here to get Jeremiah, they're going to be like, no, you're a nobody. We had authority from the king to do what we're doing. And that was true. They had authority from the king to do what they did to Jeremiah. But now the king has made a new decree that says, hey, I want him out of there. And so with that, if you go by yourself, it's going to be a problem. So take 30 men with you and then go down there and say, the king said it's okay to get him out of there. And this guy is a very interesting guy. And so look in verse number 11. So Abimelech took the men with him and went to the house of the king under the treasury, and took thence old cast cloths and old rotten rags, and let them down by the cords into the dungeon to Jeremiah. So again, I mean, this man had so much respect for Jeremiah and knew that he was weak, Brother Croft. He was going to be weak. He was going to be weak. Why? Because, I mean, he'd been in prison and they had him down there and he was just, standing in muck and mire and just standing down in that, and they hadn't been feeding him. And he said, you know what? I don't even want to hurt him, to the point that I know when we try and pull him up with these cords, with these ropes, when we try to pull him up, it's really going to hurt him. And I'm sure everyone in here probably had a rope burn at some point in time or another. The last time I got a rope burn was when we were building that thing over the front of the tabernacle. They were using the skid steer with the thing on it to lift the trusses on, and I was the rope man. And someone pulled the skid steer forward too fast, and I was barehanded, and the rope went through my hand, and I tried to clamp down on it, and I had like a brown streak right across the hand where that rope just burned a streak in my hand. And so if you've ever climbed ropes or slid down ropes, slid down a rope and you don't have gloves on, or your hands aren't super tough, you're going to get a rope burn. And so he says, and Abimelech the Ethiopian said unto Jeremiah, put now these old cast cloths and rotten rags under thine armholes, under the cords. And so he said, take these old rotten rags and these old cast cloths and stick them under your armholes, and then let the cords go over those, so that when we pull you up, it's not gonna rope burn you and tear your skins. I mean, what do you think about that, Miss Jimmy? I mean, can you believe that? I mean, again, most of the time, you can ask my wife. They moved the washcloths. They moved the washcloths in the bathroom the other day, and I'm like, hey, where are the washcloths? I didn't even look for them. I just saw that there was 3 little candle-looking things right there where the washcloths were, and I didn't even look for them, because I'm not that observant when it comes to stuff like that. And sometimes as a man, you're just not observant in those ways. And where a woman who's a natural nurturer, they're going to take care of people, and they're going to think, oh, we need to do this, and we need to be so careful. And as a man, you're just like, get up, get yourself up. And so here, this Ethiopian eunuch, he looks down and he says, hey, look, I don't want to hurt this man of God when I bring him up out of here. So let's go find what we can that's going to be nice and soft to put under his arms, so that we don't hurt him whenever we pull him up out of there. What about that right there? I found that so interesting as I was reading and studying on that God put this man in this place, again, for such a time as this. He put this man in this place who would have the boldness that would go to the king and get permission from the king, and then go against those princes. Again, I mean, Brother Croft, they already got the man of God put in prison. They could have just as easily said, hey, you're going too. God's going to reward him later. God's going to reward him later for it. But we'll look at that later. But so they drew up Jeremiah with cords and took him up out of the dungeon. And Jeremiah remained in the court of the prison. So they bring him up out of the dungeon. But again, he's still a prisoner. He doesn't get his freedom. He doesn't get his freedom till after they go into captivity. But he doesn't get his freedom. But he's back in the court of the prison where they're feeding him and where he's kind of got some freedoms. And he's not in a dungeon. He's not down in a hole. He's not standing in mire. And so look in verse number 14, and I know my time's about up right here, but we'll just get started. In verse number 14, it says, Then Zedekiah the king sent and took Jeremiah the prophet unto him into the third entry that is in the house of the Lord. Again, here he is again. Instead of just being a man and saying, hey, I'm going to talk to Jeremiah. Again, he already made a decision. The princes no doubt are mad at him. Because they stuck him down there in that dungeon to kill him. And he sent 30 men and the Ethiopian eunuch to pull him up out of there. And now he's back in the prison where they'd already come up with a way to get him, to kill him because of that. They're already mad at him. Instead of just being a man and saying, hey, you know what, I'm going to talk to Jeremiah again. We're going to talk about, what God has to say. That's not what he does. He goes and he finds him a little spot, off in the corner and says, hey, we need to talk about this. He said, and the king said unto Jeremiah, I will ask you a thing, hide nothing from me. He said, look, though, I want you to tell me what God has to say. And again, like I said, that's why what Matthew Henry said with this conviction and this corruption is so perfect. It's so perfect an example of who Zedekiah was. It is because he kept going back to Jeremiah. The word never changes. The word never changes. The prophecy does not change. Jeremiah does not change. Put me in prison, doesn't matter. Bring me out of prison, put me back in prison, it doesn't matter. Put me in a worse spot in the prison, come back out, tell me what God has to say. He's got the same thing he said the first time. He's going to say the same thing he said the first time. But here is Zedekiah, and I think in his heart, because of who Josiah was and because he was his father, and even though he was young whenever Josiah, was reigning, even though that, he was young, there was still enough of that influence in him that he had that respect for that man of God. And he said, hey, look, I want you to tell me what God has to say. And and we're going to see it next week because my time's up. We're going to see it next week. He just could not overcome whatever. He couldn't overcome his corruption. He couldn't overcome his fear. He couldn't overcome whatever it was he had in him. He could not overcome it. And every time he hardened, when I think about that verse in Proverbs, he that being often reproved and hardeneth his neck. Again, why? Because when you're reproved, there is a softening. There is a softening. When God is dealing with you, there is a softening, and you have to harden yourself and say, no, I'm not going to do it. No, I'm not going to do it. No, I'm not going to submit. I'm not going to surrender. You have to harden yourself. So every time God would send a message to him, he would weaken up a little bit, but then he'd have to harden himself up again and say, nope, I'm not going to do it this time. And then God allowed him three times, be like, hey, what's the word from God? 3 different times that he was directly spoken to. And each time he rejected that word because he hardened his neck. He hardened himself and said, nope, not going to do it. Not going to do it. And it's eventually, next week we're going to see, it's going to be to his own family's destruction. He's not going to die, but it's going to be to his family's destruction. We'll get to that next week. Thank y'all.